Welcome to this week's PermaPuheet Ihan Pihalla. I am Dominic Chase, your host. Today, our guest is Andrew McMillion, and he will share a little presentation about his place in Norway and talk about seed saving. And after that, you guys have the chance to ask questions. So, Andrew, I hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Dominic, and thanks to the Permaculture Association for inviting me to talk a little bit, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your all's questions. So, as Dominic said, my name is Andrew McMillion. I've been on the board of the Norwegian Seed Savers for the last 6-7 years, and I run a small farm with a big greenhouse. That's usually how I like to introduce myself. Where I focus on seed saving and community sustainability. We put up the greenhouse in 2016, and since then, we've expanded to a market garden of about 1,000 square meters. And we try to stack functions, of course, as much as possible. So, although we have a reproductive sort of core, which separates us from most farms, at least in our area. There are very, very few reproductive farms. We share tools with other market garden farms in the same municipality. And thanks to the whole Finnish equitting revolution, we have about 20 equitings within an hour's drive from our farm. So we never have problems getting rid of our produce. Or plants. It's actually plants that I sell the most of, small plants. It's the benefit of having a greenhouse, and also some seeds that you're allowed to sell. Most seeds you're not. So we bought the farm about 2009, and the idea was to sort of turn it into some kind of a permaculture food forest garden project, and we've been heading that way in the last couple of years. But as soon as I got in contact with the Norwegian Seed Savers, or actually before the Norwegian Seed Savers existed, I got in contact with Stephen Barstow, which was in 2014 when he wrote his book Around the World in 80 Plants. Stephen Barstow has been the head of the Norwegian Seed Savers, and before that, the plant clubs for 10 years before that, so about 15 years now. And he has the world record of the salad with the most diversity in it, some 530 varieties. And in his farm in Trondheim, most of you guys know this already, he has thousands of different varieties of plants in a very small area. So he was a super inspiration for me. And it was really in 2014-15 when I started introducing plants from his collection that the diversity started to explode on my farm. And I really started feeling connected to ecology in a different way. So just to give a little bit of context, the Norwegian Seed Savers is a part of a global network called the Community Seed Bank Revolution. So that's sort of a seed bank is a bit different than community seed bank is a little bit different than sort of a gene bank in that gene banks have their seeds frozen ex situ, it's called. It's kind of like a backup. Whereas community seed banks, they are in situ, like you see here. This is the Iowa Center of Seed Savers Exchange, which is a vegetable sanctuary that is sort of the center for the Seed Savers Exchange, where they keep most of their varieties alive and reproduce the seeds to keep them true to kind. And so the history there is simply that in the 60s, some hippies were looking for old varieties of vegetables in old catalogs, and they realized that most of the varieties, or a lot of them anyway, were missing. And they started looking for them all around the States and started collecting them and started taking care of them. And basically the context is that, since around the turn of the century, because of conventional agricultural techniques and changes like bigger tractors and hybrids, uniformity, more and more of the open pollinated seeds just disappeared because all the small farms that used to take care of them stopped taking care of them. And therefore, if nobody reproduces the seeds, they disappear. That's just how it works. And so to try and make sure that they don't disappear entirely, in 1975, the Seed Savers Exchange was established. And that really sparked a whole revolution around the world, of which the Norwegian Seed Savers is just the latest one. There are some 55, 60 community seed banks in Europe. All right. I could also go a little bit further back, and now considering the situation that we have in the East here in Europe, then it's good to mention that Nikolai Vavilov was in many ways before his time when it came to seed saving. So he traveled all around the world and created a huge collection called the Vavilov Institute in St. Petersburg. And a crazy story there, which is utterly a true story, is that this institute went through when during World War II, there was a siege of Leningrad at the time, what St. Petersburg was called back then. And I don't know, something like 1 million people died of starvation during that siege. It was a really long, I think it was like a 1.5 year siege or something. And during that time, the Vavilov Institute had a couple of people guarding the seed vault. And those people who were guarding the seed vault actually died protecting the seed vault's diversity instead of eating the seeds. So they could have easily made it through the siege because they were surrounded by food, but they didn't touch it because to them the seeds were holy. So that's sort of the tradition that I come from, I feel. And that gives a little bit of the context of what I want to talk about. Today, I'd like to just touch on 3 of what I consider to be the most important of the permaculture principles for me right now. They're all important, but these are the ones that I'm focusing on currently. So the first one for me is catch and store energy, which is actually the second permaculture principle. And I want to sort of explain my perspective on that, which has changed quite a lot since I started studying the intellectual history of ecology. There are many different branches of the intellectual history of ecology, but if you look at the permaculture branches, and especially if you look at the permaculture branches or branch that I feel I follow in, it's sort of follows from me to David Holmgren, and from David Holmgren back to Eugene Odum, who wrote The Fundamentals of Ecology in 1953, which has been rewritten in 2005 and is still quite relevant. Basically the textbook on ecology. And if you go further back in the same energy tradition, the way of looking at energy in ecology and how energy moves through ecologies, then you get to Erwin Schrödinger, who wrote a really small but very critical book in 1944 called What is Life? And then if you go further back, you can get to Vladimir Vernadsky and his book, The Biosphere. But I'm going to focus on Schrödinger because for me, of all these 4 thinkers, it was really Schrödinger who put it all into perspective when it comes to how energy works. And that's because he tries to answer a paradox, which is called Schrödinger's paradox, of course, named after him. And in true form for geniuses, first they'll ask a really difficult question and then they'll give you the answer to it later on. This is a thing that Schrödinger was able to do in What is Life? And he asks simply, how come it is that living systems increase their organization despite entropy increasing? And that's called Schrödinger's paradox. And what that really means, basically, if you just boil it down to simple language, is that energy is always going from a concentrated form like the sun, where it's really concentrated, and then it goes out into dissipated. So it goes from high quality energy to low quality energy. That's always the case. So for instance, when you light a candle, it's always the case that once you light the candle starts to diminish in size. It never grows. So it never becomes more organized. It always becomes less organized. That's just the way the universe works, and that's called entropy. But then Schrödinger says, but it seems to us, however, that life is doing the opposite. It seems that life is taking the disordered energy from the sun and then ordering it through photosynthesis, right? And so he's trying to understand how does that work. And what he says is that life is about 2 different sets of processes. He says that on the one side you have order from disorder processes, which is, photosynthesis, it's metabolism, basically, production. And then on the other side, you have order from order sets of processes, which reproduction, DNA synthesis instead of photosynthesis. So he points out how important it is to understand both of these two sets of processes to understand life. And what he says is that our culture and our world understands the order from disorder very well. We know very well how to build things. We know how to break things down by chewing them, by harvesting energy in nature through photosynthesis. These are things that we understand quite well already back in 1944. But what we didn't understand then is how reproduction worked. So in his book, he says, I think it has something to do with chromosomes, but he doesn't really know how it works. He tries to explain it. But of course, 10 years later, Watson and Crick discover the double helix. And in their Nobel speech, they attribute it in part to Schrödinger for pointing the way to understanding how reproduction works. So this is a pretty critical idea in the intellectual history of ecology, and it really is at the crux of understanding how energy works. And so for me on the farm, capturing and storing energy is super important. I use the greenhouse, of course, but I try to use all the other permaculture principles to slow down the disordering effects of entropy on my ecology and to try as much as I can to work in syntropy with ecology. And that's what life is really all about. It's a syntropic force and it works against the entropic force. It's quite a simple thing, but it's really important if you want to understand how to capture and store energy, to really understand what you're doing. It's not just about holding a lot of energy, but it's also about maintaining order in your ecology. So it's actually quite a deep and important principle. The second principle is to creatively use in response to change and respond to change, which for me has become super critical in light of all the different ecological crises we're going through. And I think it's super important for the permaculture movement, to be aware of what a critical role we have in opening up bottlenecks in these times of highly disordering effects on ecology. We have the ability to really reverse that. And that's what I've been focusing on, trying to understand. I believe that we need a proper paradigm shift from sort of an anthropocentric worldview where we're calculating everything in terms of how it works for us and move it over into a biocentric paradigm where we see all the connections between everything and that we're working in syntropy with the whole web of life. And that's not very easy to bring about. It's very hard to know how to do that. I've worked some on this and wrote a blog called Web of Ecological Thought, where I sort of collect all of my different ideas on how this can be, and I have all kinds of new ideas for how we can do this better. But the basic principle is that we need to change entirely the way we look at each other and the way we look at our ecology, and try and find tools to encourage other people to do the same. So I won't talk too much about that, but if anybody wants to read my blog post on this, it's available for free at macmillion.no. And then finally, the last principle that I'm really focused on, which of course fits perfectly into what I've been up to for the last 10 years, is use and value diversity. And I put seeds there as well, because it's really once you get onto the reproductive level that you really start to see the beauty of diversity and understand how diversity works. Because it's great to add a bunch of diverse plants to your farm, but it's not really until you can get them to reproduce stably that they've really become a part of the ecosystem. And so that's what I'm doing on my farm. I'm very much copying Stephen Barsa there, literally in many cases by getting DNA from him. In this case, we're looking at Sherpa onion, which is one of my favorite, Allium wallacei. Here's another one called Allium sarnum, or nodding onion, also known as Chicago onion. All of the alliums, the whole genus, is about 600 to 800 plants. They're all edible. They all have beautiful flowers, and so and they're super. Almost all of them are from the north, so they're quite hardy. This one, Allium sarnum, is super hardy, so you can harvest it fresh in the middle of the winter, and it looks practically like it's in the middle of the summer in the wintertime. And yeah, so lots of different alliums. I think I must have about 35 to 40 different species. I'm especially interested in garlic. So I have a collection of about 40 or 50 different garlic varieties. Most of them are from true garlic seed from Seed Savers Exchange. So I'm trying to see the latest adaptations, genetic adaptations in garlic to see which ones might be better suited. I've written a blog post about it as well, if anybody wants to read it, and also on potato onions, which is another kind of rare heirloom onion that became sort of fell out of favor, but now we're trying to bring it back, and that also I'm bringing back through seeds. And then, of course, there's a whole host of different adaptogen, medicinal, perennial plants. Here we're looking at two different species. We've got the red one up in the corner is Caranopsis lanceolata, and the white one is Caranopsis pilosula, which is also known as poor man's ginseng. Super beautiful climbing plant that the insects love, and where the root is medicinal. And in this case, you can see it climbing on a Atriplex hortensis plant that has gone to seed. So having that amount of flowering, climbing plants in your ecosystem really changes things. The insects just love it. And when you have endless wave after wave of flowering plants because you're letting your plants become reproductive, it changes the whole way in which your ecology interacts with the different pieces of the ecology. And it's beautiful. I've also written a little bit about the king of Sansai, or also known as Udo, which is one of Stephen Barstow's favorite plants. Here you can see how tall it gets in 1 year. This is like a 30-year-old plant from Stephen Barstow. And he puts a bucket on top of it in the spring, which you can see here, to blotch the leaves. And then you cut them like you see in the top right here. And then there's all kinds of different recipes. So this plant is like hardy to -40 and can tolerate shade with no problem and hardly any soil. It's just a wonder plant. It's also genetically related to Panax ginseng, so it has adaptogenic powers in it. Yeah, and then of course there's the pumpkin family or cucumber family. I'm totally nuts about cucumbers. I've grown about 50 different varieties of pumpkins, and I've started to breed my own. This one is called Melting Cup, which I've also written a little bit about. Super good plant, produces a huge amount that you can eat and store all through winter. So I really advise people to grow more of them. They give so much. And then of course there's lettuce. I have all kinds of whole bunch of different lettuce plants. I have maybe some 200 different plants that I've been saving seeds from. So nowhere near what Stephen Barstow does, but still quite a lot of diversity. All right, so that's pretty much, those are the sort of the 3 topics that I wanted to talk about today. I actually wanted to leave as much time as I could open for discussions. So I just really sort of recap here that for me, the catch and store energy ethic is not just about the energy, but it's also about offsetting the effects of entropy. And it's about noticing that life is a syntropic force, and to sort of tap into that in a way so that you're not just thinking about building up energy that you store in forms of calories, but you think about the fact that you're building ecosystems that can offset the effects of entropy. And you could be building up calories, which is what humans do. We build up calories in a very entropic way, right? And that's why food forest gardening, which can do the same thing but do it in a syntropic way without destroying, is a much, much better way of doing things. And we need to head much more quickly in that direction. So that's at the top. And then there's creatively use and respond to change, which for me is all about that biocentric paradigm shift to get people to stop thinking about themselves just as individuals and connect them, ground them really in ecology properly. It's a super interesting question. How do we get people to do that? And if anybody has good ideas, please let me know. Lately, I'm thinking about playing around with theater more and more. because there are some pretty good examples from the past of people who've used theater to break down divides between each other. And my thinking is, if you could do that between each other, maybe we could use that also to break down the divides between us and nature in interesting ways. So that's something I'm playing with nowadays. And then there's the last one, use and value diversity, or seeds. And of course, when you have a great thinker like Schrodinger point the direction to reproduction, and when you see our culture is so dominated by production logic, right? It's called gross national product. It's not called gross national reproduct. But why not? Why isn't it called gross national reproduct if Schrodinger says that life is just as much about reproduction as it is about production? How come all we're measuring in our society is production? So these are pretty important things to be thinking about, and that definitely link to ecology and definitely link to permaculture. And it all heads, for me, in the direction of what I call ecosystems resonance, which is about getting aligned with your ecology and riding waves, beautiful waves in your ecology, wanting to spend time in your ecology as opposed to feeling like you're forced to. I see so many people working in agriculture feeling worn out or burnt out because they're always working, they feel. Well, if what you love to do is be in ecology and work with your ecology, it doesn't really feel like work. It more feels like therapy. So it's like playing music in a band. You know, a band member wouldn't say that it's work to play. He's playing, right? And that's how it needs to be for us too in ecology. And it's not before, I think, that we start changing the way we relate to ecology to the point where we're able to resonate with our ecology, that we'll be able to get other people to see the point of doing it, and then it'll catch on. But as long as it's all about calculating how much work goes into it and how much energy we're taking out of it instead of how much energy we're putting into it. So we really need to change our relationship to nature, and that's sort of the summing up of my little chat here. And I think that with that we can start opening up to questions from people.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, very much. This was very inspiring to listen. Also, how you sum up the bridge to permaculture. To give you one answer to one of your questions, the next week's sessions, there is Dan McTernan, and he probably found a way how to bridge the paradigm shift. And he's going into transpersonal psychology to do that.
So I would like to attend that.
Yeah, please be our guest next week. Be here and listen to him. Okay, 4 questions, 2 ways. Please put them either in the chat or go down to the reactions, click reactions, and then raise hand so that I see that you have a question. Or if you just want to comment or want to add something to it, please. Okay, so there's already Lumia. Please start.
Oh, now I'm listening. Yes, now. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for being here. I was just wondering, like, how did you get started? Because it sounded like it sounded amazing, and it was like, and I'm just thinking, like, where am I now? Like, I would really, I like seed saving a lot also, but you know, maybe it's a 2-part question, like how did you get started? How did you get interested? How did you get going? And then would you suggest that someone else does it the same way, or would you have other tips to,
Yeah, good questions. I would say that my story comes from a sense of urgency when it comes to climate change. So I spent a number of years in politics for the Green Party and working in tech, and then getting disillusioned with both politics and tech, and feeling that everybody's talking about political and technological solutions, but I don't see them working anywhere. It's just talk, right? And I just didn't feel like that was going to be enough. And I wanted to do something practical. I wanted to actually put my life to use, not just hypothetically, but but in the literal sense. And so, and I also felt like I didn't know enough about ecology or the climate crisis. So I just started studying ecology. And then when I looked to sort of the first reactions that were active reactions to the climate crisis, I mean, if you look at the history of permaculture, you have the Limits to Growth report comes in 1972. 1974, permaculture starts, right? So it's literally one of the very first practical answers to the climate crisis. And so for me, that meant a lot. So is that there was this whole culture that already existed. And then once I got into permaculture, I started hearing about seed savers, right? I also met Vandana Shiva, who was a big inspiration. She came to a project I tried to do in a political project to try and get the Norwegian bank to sell their shares in Monsanto, which we weren't able to do, but at least Vandana Shiva came and held a lot of talk, and she inspired me to get into seed saving. And then it was simply a matter of doing it. And the first year I tried was a total catastrophe. And I mean, I don't even want to, it's embarrassing to admit how much of a catastrophe it was. It was so bad that 2012 I did nothing. And then 2013, I heard Elaine Ingham talk on Sustainable World Radio. She was talking about that you need to focus on the 30 centimeters below the surface more than the 30 centimeters on top. And then a light bulb went off in my head. Aha. So I have to make sure that the soil is right. And once you figure that out, it makes the changes the game entirely. It's like, yeah, it's a whole new ball game. So if I was going to say what I would advise people to do is don't wait, make mistakes. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Try to follow the permaculture principles because, like, for instance, the greenhouse that I have is just too big for my farm. It's a 300 square meter greenhouse, and I only need maybe 100 square meters. So it's over-dimensioned for my farm. Now, of course, it's a luxury problem. It's great. Who doesn't want 300 square meters? I can have parties in there and everything, right? But it took a lot of energy and work to put it up. So permaculture says small and simple solutions, right? That's one of the principles. So as long as you're sticking to the principles and you're trying to understand how ecology works and you're doing your best not to destroy things and you're trying to look at how you can bring things together and you just start saving the seeds that you can. Admittedly, amaranth is my favorite family. Why? It's the easiest to save seeds from, right? And it's very adaptable and very robust, right? So start with the easy stuff. You don't need to start with kale. But then also find stuff that you like to eat and build relations with your plants, build relations with your ecology on all levels, both food relationships, nutrient relationships, energy relationships, all kinds of different relationships to your ecology. The more you feel related, the more happy you'll be. The more you'll want to protect your ecology, and the more you'll want to bring other people in and connect them as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Okay, no other question yet. So one from me. Is there a plant that you have really difficulties in getting the seeds?
Yeah, you mean actually getting a hold of the seeds or getting them to sort of work with me?
Yeah, probably both.
Both. Yes, there are always plants that are tricky. And so that's one of the things I advise people to do first is before you sow any seed, Google it and try and find out, what does it need? There's a website called plantsforafuture.org, pfaf.org, and it gives you a lot of the most important information. Usually the most tricky plants are perennials because they need some form of stratification. But to be honest, there are plants that are annuals that are tricky too. So one of the ones that took me a bit of time to crack was the gourd branch of the cucurbit family. So there's sort of like, you could say there's a clan of plants within the cucurbit family that are called gourds. And some of them are used to make nests or drums or cups. They're kind of like pumpkins, but with a much harder shell usually. Some of them are really edible, like Kukuzi gourd, which is my favorite gourd. And some of them are practical, like loofah gourd, which you can use to make like cleaning sponges out of, or just sponges in general. And so, but the interesting thing about gourds is that they need special kinds of treatment to get the seeds to pop. So first thing you need to know is that you need to scarify the seed. So the seed needs to think that it's gone through some sort of digestive tract, right? And so that the outer hard shell is cracked. But you want to make sure that when you do that, that you don't damage the embryo inside. So you have to, what I use is like a nail cutter, and I just am very careful about cutting the edge off of it, just enough so that I can see the embryo, but that I don't actually damage the embryo. That's the first step. And then the second step is it needs to remain humid. So you need to make sure, but it needs to breathe. So that's like a trade-off, right? How do you keep seeds breathable but still humid without them drying out? Tricky. And then the third thing that this plant needs is it needs a temperature of around 26 to 27 degrees. Now, none of those three things are very hard to do on their own, but all three of them are a little bit tricky to do, together. So that took a little bit of time to figure out how to get that to work, and now it works perfectly fine. And I have, I can save my own seeds from the gourd family. So that's one example. Another one that I talk a lot about, because I have a seed saving course online that's on YouTube, which is quite good in-depth seed course. It's actually only open to members of the Norwegian Seed Savers, but in there I go through the 8 most important families, plant families, and one of them, of course, is actually not a family; it's a genus. It's the allium, and alliums they're photosensitive, so they need to have light to be able to sprout. But they also obviously need to stay humid. And usually they need a cold period. So you usually sow alliums. There are some exceptions, but you usually sow alliums in the fall. And the trick that I got from Stephen Barstow there is that when you're sowing alliums, you want to put a thin layer of sand on top once you've sown them. So you sow them on the surface, and then you put a thin layer of sand on top of them so that the sand does not block the light. So it's thin enough that the light gets in, but it's also thick enough that the humidity stays in. So, and it also then protects against mosses sort of growing on top. So those are two. I mean, that's a huge category of plants. Those are some of the ones. But in terms of getting a hold of seeds, I would really like to get a hold of Panax ginseng seeds, but I haven't been able to do that. I really would like to have Panax ginseng on my farm. Yeah. So those are a couple of good examples. I see somebody has a question here. Would you have any more reading recommendations on ecology besides those you already mentioned? Your favorite resources on ecology or permaculture? On my website, I have this Web of Ecological Thoughts, and in there you'll have the whole list of all of the people who've had the most impact on me. It depends on what branch of ecology. I mean, I'm also very much about ecology in practice, not just ecology as a science. And there I like people like Wendell Berry, for instance. The Unsettling of America is a really good book in which he sort of explains the history of agriculture in the States. Yeah, that would be one of my favorites. Also on the ethics side of things, because I think for me, ecology, the scientific study of ecology is very much sort of just matter of fact. But if you think about the fact that humans have been misaligned with our ecology for thousands and thousands of years, there's never been a time in which it's been more acute to find a way of having a new form of ethic towards ecology. And when I look at all the ethical traditions in the world, and thinkers, there's one thinker that really jumps out to me, and that is Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas was a deep ecology philosopher in the 60s. And he's written several books about how to relate to ecology through an ethical system that is biocentric instead of anthropocentric. So yeah, The Phenomenon of the Life, I think it's called, his main book. But he has several really good books. So those would be some people that have influenced me. There we go. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank
Have you
you.
managed to get seeds from garlic? That's a good question. I personally haven't, but I have lots. I haven't managed to reproduce seeds myself from garlic, but I've managed to get a hold of lots of true garlic seed from people who have. Um, but a lot of the ways in which garlic, as you know, is mostly vegetatively reproductive. So the whole allium genus is super reproductive, but it clones itself just as much as it sexually reproduces itself. So obviously, a garlic clove is just a clone. So when you plant one clove, you get anywhere from 6 to 30 new cloves every year. Those are all clones, but they also make air bulbils, which you could kind of say are seeds, but they're like cloned seeds. A lot of people wonder if allium has been sort of discouraged to be sexually reproductive by humans, because if you look at the most sort of cultivated um, garlics, those would be like regular garlic. They don't even have a flowering head anymore. Whereas at least all the ones that I work on are all hardneck garlics, and those at least still have um, a seed head, even though it's lost its ability to sexually reproduce under normal conditions. The way I understand it, you have to go in and sort of use tweezers to take out the bulbils for it to become sexually reproductive. So it sort of needs human interaction at this stage to become sexually reproductive. And I just haven't been that focused on that, and instead focused on trying out varieties that other people have managed to get to go to seed to see what best adapts to our environment. Mm. All right. Any other questions? I can also mention, or I'm adding in here, do it yourself seeds, DIYseeds.org is a super good website that has free videos on on how to save seeds from all the most important plants. I use it a lot, and I refer to it in my seed courses all the time. You have really all you need to know there about saving seeds, and on top of it, they've made these really beautiful drawings of the plant families to show you how everything's related, and sort of, yeah, it's just very beautifully done. It's done by a sort of an eco-village collective that got started in 1973 in Switzerland, France, and the Ukraine, amongst other places. I think maybe also Austria. And they have just really focused on doing an exceptionally good job on the reproductive side of things. And of course, since it's European, yeah, it's quite nice to have as a resource. All right. Any other questions? Let's see. How much do you let the plants at your farm do their thing on their own, and how much do you guide or cultivate them? Regarding seeds, do you sometimes just see what happens? Very good question. I always talk about artificial and natural selection. Um, I think it's sad that humans have gone so far in the artificial selection process. And I think that now more than ever, as global warming starts to hit us more and more, it becomes imperative and ethical for us to use natural adaptation more. So I always try and coordinate both natural and artificial selection. So, for instance, I'm working on both spinach and on leek, on trying to adapt them to the light conditions in Norway, because we have very extreme light conditions. And so what I do is I sow them uh, with thinking in mind, keeping in mind when they will become reproductive. So in this case of spinach, it's like at 12 hours of sunlight. So I have to sow them in the fall, obviously, because in March already there's more than 12 hours of light in Norway. So there's no point sowing spinach in the spring; it just goes straight to seed. But if you sow it in the fall, so if in my case I sow it in like early August, then it doesn't have time to become reproductive before there's then less than 12 hours of light. And what I do then is I take out any plants that do go to seed. I don't let them live. I don't let them reproduce. So that's the artificial selection, but I'm using natural selection as well. Uh, and I try always to both take out ones that I think aren't going to adapt to local conditions based on what I know about the ecology where I live. And also, if I see any individuals that look like they might be able to adapt better, then I select those, right? So that's positive and negative selection. So yeah, my advice is, as much as possible, try to adapt your plants to local conditions. In the beginning, I was doing this whole stun thing, sheer total utter neglect, but I don't find that to be very successful personally. So I'm somewhere in between. I don't baby my plants to death, but I also don't, like, if I see them faltering or something, I do what I can to help them. So some sort of a balance. And also I use artificial um, tools that a lot of permaculturalists might not do. So for instance, just the fact that I have a greenhouse, and a lot of the stuff I do is more conventional, you can say, than most. Although I will say that my plan has been to plant more trees and berries and go in the direction of sort of silvopasture, food forest garden over the long term. But my guess is that the farm will always have some sort of cultivated seed saving aspect to it. So yeah, it's I suppose it's not in any one category in that regard. How about carrot seeds? How easy is it to collect and save them? What are the easiest vegetable seeds to be collected as a beginner? So the absolute easiest is for sure the amaranth family. I can just show you quickly from my seed saving course. Hold on a second. That in sort of order of the easiest to the hardest families, and which ones that I focus on. Let's see here if I just share quickly here. This one. Okay, so this is sort of my longer course, which I'm not going to go through now, obviously. And you can see here that first we go through terminology, and then after terminology, which is common for all plants, then we have spinach, which is the easiest family, and then we have tomatoes, or sorry, we have tomatoes, and then we have salad, and then squash, onions, carrots, and kale. All right, so that's an order of difficulty. And why are carrots and kale the most difficult? Well, because those are outcrossers, right? And also because they're biannual. They go to seed in the second year. So onions, carrots, and cabbage all need to be overwintered somehow. In the case of onions, they pretty much do that on their own. So you don't usually have to take them in. And if you do, they store very well, right? You just keep them dry and they're fine and out of light. Whereas with carrots, you have to keep them, you have to grow a full crop of carrots, then you have to select about 100 carrots, and then you have to overwinter them in a basement at right around 0 degrees with 90% humidity in sand, and then you have to be carefully taking out all the ones that rot during the winter, and then you need to plant them again in the spring, and then they need to go to full seed, right? So that's why carrots are a bit more tricky than other plants. But other than that, they're super easy. Once you've gotten them to overwinter and you put them in the ground, all you have to do is have some bamboo sticks to keep them from, keep the heads from falling over. And then you just collect the seeds in the fall. It's not hard at all to collect seeds from carrots, other than you need to overwinter them. And also it depends on how wet your falls are. If you have a very wet fall, you'll want to protect your carrot seeds somehow. So I usually grow carrots in the greenhouse when I'm trying to save seeds from it. The absolute easiest is actually, spinach, all the amaranth family. My favorite is Atriplex hortensis. Let's see if I can show you that. Just such a beautiful plant. So gorgeous and tastes amazing. Let's see if I can share that with you here. It's the absolute easiest to save seeds from. You literally just throw the seeds on the ground and up they come. This is what they look like when they're small. And this is what they look like when they're big. At this stage here, you can still chop them down all the way to the ground and just leave one leaf and they'll grow right back up again. They're super easy to move around, super nutritious, and yeah, there's nothing not to like about them. I use them as ground cover until anything else needs to be put in because they're super easy to weed out. So it's like what I call active weeding, where you sort of use the weed in the place that you don't want other weeds to show up, right? So this thing just outcompetes all the other weeds. And then they're super easy to weed, so your weeding job is done easily. And also it's a regenerative practice. You want to keep your soil covered at all times. This thing, you can sow it in the springtime, and even if it's like -10 at night, the small sprouts will still survive. So yeah, that's probably the absolute easiest to save seeds from, because that was the question here, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Any other questions? The plant I just showed is mountain spinach, Atriplex hortensis. There you go. Sorry, not triplex, Atriplex hortensis. There we go. It's a very common plant, and it's basically a weed. Like the amaranth family has some 2,000 species, and lots of them are some of the most invasive weeds in the world. So you really need to know what you're doing. But for me, that's not a negative thing. Why would an invasive plant that's edible, that you can control easily, and that gives huge crops in a time period when you've got nothing else growing? That's like, how would you not use that? It's totally unpermaculture not to use that, because it's about stacking functions. In this case, it's keeping the weeds out, it's keeping the ground covered, it's keeping the bacterias alive in the soil and the microbes, and then when you're done, you can eat the weeds, and then you can use the space to plant something else. So it's just a super plant. Okay, this next question is asked in Finnish, so if somebody could translate that for me real quickly.
It's not a question, it's more a tip for the carrots that in the northern parts you have to kind of remove leaves from them.
Okay. All right.
If I may just continue on the carrot, just an experience I'd like to share. I don't know what happened, but I sowed carrots, and then it seems some of them were left in the ground, no? So maybe they broke, the green part broke, and I didn't get them out, and then I forgot about them. So next year they actually, like, they survived in the soil, and they went to seed the next year, which was very interesting, and they made very big and flowers. And that I have actually been able to, I sowed those seeds, no? And out came carrots, but they were pretty much, well, not quite white, but very pale yellow and huge. So they did something, because the normal, like the carrots I first sowed, no, they were just, your normal orange carrot seeds that you would get from the store. No? So what happened?
Well, one of two things could have happened there. It's impossible for me to know for sure what happened, but one thing that you do need to care about with carrots is that you need to make sure that you don't sow them next to wild carrots, because if you do, they will cross with wild carrots because they're outcrossers. And if they do cross with wild carrots, it's gonna revert right back to the wild carrot, because the wild genes are way more dominant than the cultivated genes. So that's one possibility. The other one is that since they're outcrossers, they need many. So like I said earlier, you need 100 carrots if you're going to save good seeds from them. Minimum 30, right? And that's to avoid genetic depression. So what probably happened, the most likely thing that happened is that they got genetically depressed because maybe they only reproduced with themselves, because that does happen, right? Or if it was, how many plants did you have?
Maybe like 5.
5. So that's definitely genetic depression. So it could be genetic depression or they crossed, right? Those would be the two most likely possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, the funniest things that they were actually quite good carrots, so I have been eating them.
Yeah, and the color is not an issue. I mean,
Yeah.
the color that's something that we've cultivated. The original ones were red, so that doesn't matter. And they're all kinds of different colors, in carrots. So yeah. But I
Yeah,
mean, that's actually a cool thing that you were able to do that, if you ask me, because it's not usual that the carrot will survive a Finnish winter.
exactly. Yeah, that's something I was also like, whoa, what is this? But it is actually a carrot. And then the ones I then sowed, and I got all of those out, I think. So I do have a few of the huge ones in the basement now. So I will I will bring them out. I don't have 30, but I will bring them out just to see what what happens.
But I mean, this basic way approach is actually quite good, because in general, like, it depends on what you're selecting for. But I like to take plants that have made it through the winter, that have that's like positive selection for me. Like, oh my God, this plant made it through the winter. It deserves to be reproduced. But what you can do then is just add it to a mixture of other plants, right? That then you're making sure that it stays vital and that those genes are reproduced. And the more you do that, the more locally adapted your plants will get. So I try as much as I can to let stuff overwinter, even if I'm like 99% chance that it won't survive. I'd rather let it die in the winter and then just compost itself in the spring than that I like clean everything up before. It's anyway much better for the ecology for it to die in place. And if you're lucky that it survives, then you're definitely done. That's a serious natural selection process. A Finnish and a Norwegian winter. If a plant can beat it through that, then you definitely want to keep working with it.
Yep,
So yeah,
yep.
that's good.
Good stuff. Yeah, and maybe just everyone can try it. So it's we are here near Tampere, no? So all the Finns here. So feel free to try. No, it was a winter with lots of snow, so it had a good cover. No.
I also really believe in trying to create your own varieties. I know almost all the community seed banks are really big on open pollinated plants and trying to maintain old cultivars. I am as well, but I think it's just as important to be playing around and making mixes. So I would have taken those carrots and maybe sown them together with some other carrots, to cross to make a new variety, maybe, right? That's one thing you could do. I mean, it's a lot of fun when in my opinion, most of the fun happens on the reproduction side. Production is fun, but I mean, it's all the flowering and just completing the full cycle of a plant. It's so important. And I think in our world where we want to try and get people to have a deeper connection, that's one of a really good way of getting people to deeply connect, is to sort of teach them about reproduction, and then also to have them experience it for themselves. Because there's nothing better than like being connected to a population of plants that you've been connected to for years, and you see it evolve, or because they evolve every year. There's like the population's a little bit different than the year before, and to know that you're playing that game with nature, which is a game that humans have been playing with nature for thousands and thousands of years, right? And then now suddenly we decided we're not going to play it anymore because we're going to play video games instead. It's insane, the world we live in. Everybody was playing that game up until recently, you know. So yeah, and it's the game that our hearts want us to play. It's when we're doing it, we can feel the real connection, and I feel sorry for so many people in the world who haven't been able to experience that. I really want more people to experience that.
Yeah, it is. It's really fun. I like it too. It's just fun, and then of course, yeah, the connection is much deeper than if you just do the vegetables. No.
Totally. Yeah, because you have to then start the whole thing again. You have to get seeds from someplace and then start again. Here you can just build and build and build and build. And also, once you have your own seeds are one of the biggest bottlenecks for most people. Where do I get seeds from? How do I know the good quality of the seeds? Are they adapted to local conditions? Well, all those things you don't have to think about if you produce your own seeds, reproduce your own seeds, and you'll have a huge amount, so you can use it to experiment in all different ways. Like my ground cover, I use seeds for ground cover because that's the best kind of ground cover. But most people can't afford to ground cover with seeds because they have to buy it in. Then, of course, it becomes an expense. Once you're producing your own seeds, ground cover is easy. Throw out all your extra seeds and your ground is covered. You know.
Cool.
Yeah. All right, I think we could maybe have time for one more question, but I have to go and catch a train pretty soon. So maybe if anybody has any more questions. All right.
Okay. So I would say we're coming to an end here, or?
I think so, yeah.
Very fascinating, totally. I like to thank you, Andrew, for having you here at the Finnish Permaculture Lecture Series of the PermaPuheet. So I will send you the link for next week, so you're invited to take part in the transpersonal psychology lecture.
I'm really thankful for that. I really look forward to it, and thanks so much for inviting me. And yeah, and I also want to say big up to Finland in general. I've been there a couple times lately. Really enjoy it. The people are amazing. And sauna culture, my God, that is taking over in Norway too. I love it. So yeah, keep staying connected to nature and enjoy the spring.
Will do, will do. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, I have some links left for you folks. There's still the Nordic Permaculture Festival in August. And if you have time, please give us feedback. And as mentioned several times, the last lecture of the PermaPuheet series is next week. It's with Dan McTernan, and the topic is permaculture and transpersonal psychology. Okay, everyone, thanks for joining. Thanks for being part. Have a good time. See you next week. Cheers. Bye-bye. Kiitos. Hey, hey.
Bye-bye.